Coming up, we talk with the great Bob Windrem, NetsDaily, Net Income, all the things that have been happening this season, all our thoughts on the future as well. We're going to get into it all, but first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie. We'll do away with that real quick. No Adam Armbrecht on the show. Even better. Massive upgrade for us here on Locked On Nets. We are joined by the great Bob Windrem. You might know him as Net Income. You might also know him in the Twitter streets at Nets Daily. Here to talk Brooklyn Nets, talk about this season, talk about what's to come. Bob, sir, how are you?
I'm recovering. Proudly recovering.
But just as a programming note, we are recording this Tuesday morning. Following, I'm sure what Bob is referring to here is the loss to the Memphis Grizzlies on Monday night. This show will air on Thursday. So if there's a massive breaking piece of injury or life or whatever news that happens between now and then, forgive us, because programming schedules are what they are. We wanted to have Bob on the show here, one of the all-time, sort of just like maybe the all-time just Nets OG here in terms of the online streets, the Twitter streets, the just breaking down the team essentially on a day-to-day level for decades now. Bob, why don't you just, before we get into this season, if you want to just let everyone know sort of like your background, your coverage of the Nets, for those that don't know, I'm sure there's a large contingent of our fans that already do know this, just because you are, you are who you are. You're one of the people that's talked about the Nets for as long as it can be. But some background on you, and then we'll get into the Nets this season.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 19 years. The site is 20 years old, as we noted last month. And I joined the second year of the site. I joined John Schumann, who is the founder of NetsDaily and now at NBA.com, who does the power rankings every week and deep dives. And essentially, we have been able to get something up every day on NetsDaily. The last time we did not have a new story up was about 5 years ago. We went all the way through the pandemic getting stuff up, which is probably, my proudest achievement. And before that, I was the senior investigative producer for NBC News. I worked 40 years at NBC News. I covered the CIA for 30 years. I covered terrorism. I covered Al-Qaeda. And I wound up spending a lot of time overseas, and to a certain extent, joining NetsDaily was meant to be a respite from all the world's problems. But now I've just translated it to a smaller venue. All the problems of the world is now confined to HSS.
Would you say that, before we get into the Nets this season, would you say that there's more cloak and dagger stuff happening in the inner workings of the CIA or within NBA front offices? Which one do you think obfuscates more around the inner workings? Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but maybe not.
I'm going to say something, and it's going to sound strange, but as I've often said, I've been lied to more by the NBA than the CIA.
I thought you would say that, yeah.
Yes. CIA is much more clever, by the way, in the NBA. I want to get that out too.
Sure, I thought that it might go that way. So, let's talk a little bit. We'll start this season, and then we'll kind of push out forward in terms of like what the Nets are. You've been around the team for, like I said, decades, and kind of seen the ups and the downs, and maybe a few more downs and ups in that time. When we're looking at this season so far, how they sit here, we're recording this March 1st. They're, as of this recording, they're 24-37, 2.5 games out of the play-in. How would you say this season has gone compared to expectations? I think we can probably say how it's gone just in a high level macro view of it. But in terms of like your own expectations going into this year, coming out of the KD Kyrie era, moving into this new era, where would you put your sort of like level of, I guess I said expectation a few times here, but like you're just, level of enjoyment maybe about how this year has gone?
Yeah. We have a reporters roundtable every year before the season. And, the ultimate question is, what do you think the record will be? And at that point I said, 42 wins, which of course is what they won in 2018-19, which I saw as a model for this year. And I said I could be argued 3 games either way. Now we're not going to get to even the low end of that range. So obviously, it's been disappointing. Some of it has to do with injuries. Some of it has to do with illness. Some of it has to do with this, that, or the other thing. I mean, there were key injuries at key times. Cam Thomas missed 9 games. Lonnie Walker IV missed 16. Dennis Smith Jr. missed 15. Nick missed 10, on and on and on. So some of it was that. And some of it has to do with, the way the roster is constructed. It was not constructed in an optimum way. I think one of the reasons is it's a pretty flat rotation. And that can be good, but in this case, because it gives you an opportunity to have your bench supply, needed efforts when people are down. But there seemed to be too much of a similar type of player. And then, there were the coaching issues. Jacques Vaughn is a wonderful person, but I think he was out of his league. And it's unfortunate that you have to say that, but I think that's true. And I think also beyond that, there's things that I just don't understand. I don't understand how you can go into 2 crucial games with Atlanta and blow them out. I mean, when that series, quote unquote, began, the Nets were 4 games out of 10. If they had lost those 2 games, they would have been 6 games out. And instead, they won those 2 games in convincing fashion. The team looked as good as it's looked at any point during the year, other than, maybe a few games very early. But then to go into last night and to just collapse against the team that had 9 players, had lost 12 of their last 14. And, each time you thought they were going to come back, they were unable to do it. And that, to me, the whole experience of this year adds up to a certain malaise that I just can't figure out. I mean, the players supposedly love each other. They're great. Everybody compliments each other. The personalities are very good. But at the end of the day, you have this disparity that just is mind-boggling. And, without getting into individual performances, not just last night, but overall, at the base of that malaise is an inconsistency in effort, an inconsistency in just being smart. And, you have a new coach, so he's playing with rotations, and that's understandable. You have a new point guard, and, that's understandable. But again, we know how they can play. They played extremely well against Atlanta. And then they come, to last night, and they collapse. And again, to me, you can go through all the various things, the injuries, the flat rotations, the coaching, whatever. But at the end of the day, you just look at it and you say, what's going on here? And I think that's the most troubling part of the season.
I think Nets fans have asked themselves the same questions along the way, right? It's like, what is going on here? Because it is hard. You gave a list which I think is accurate of all these different things that tend to sort of crop up. You mentioned the roster build, you mentioned just the overall energy, the coaching, or lack thereof, maybe at times. Real quick about the roster. When you say the roster was not optimized, and if I'm re-putting those words in your mouth, please correct me. But let's just say the roster has let's say it has problems.
Right. No, that's
would you say the roster issues are more the function of circumstance or lack of vision, right? Because sometimes you can be put in a spot in the NBA where you are stuck with sort of what you have. Sometimes you can be stuck with misunderstanding what you need, right? And so do you see the roster construction as just like this is sort of the spot they were put in, or it was sort of maybe like a misfire on the part of maybe Sean Marks when he was actually building this season's
I think it's both. I think the circumstances, the key limiting circumstance is their desire to stay under the luxury tax threshold. And the way the CBA works, if they go over the luxury tax threshold this year or next year, they are in the repeater tax and under CBA restrictions through 2028. So if you're looking long-term, if you're building a business long-term, which is what Josiah is an expert in, you have to look at that. And you can spend a lot of money if you're the Golden State Warriors. But, they looked at what they had and what the reality was last summer. And they believed, accurately as it turns out, that there was no way they were going to contend. I mean, the mantra was we're going to compete, but not contend. So the circumstances are part of it. And when you look at what they did in the offseason, other than the draft, their top signing of the by their own admission of the summer was Dennis Smith Jr., who was a veterans minimum, and they signed a number of players to veterans minimum contracts. And again, in order to keep it below the luxury tax. The other circumstance that is an issue, and the question is it more of a circumstance or is it more of a failing, is Ben Simmons, who is the elephant in the room at $37.8 million this year, $40.3 million next year. I'm not sure how much they could have done better, but what I think there were certain things that they lacked, and at the beginning of the year, and they also didn't make much of an effort to correct them. I mean, again, we can go through all the little issues. I mean, Spencer Dinwiddie is, I think, very typical of what the problem was with the rotation. He was put into a position where he really wasn't suited for it, and that's the pure point guard position. And he's not a pure point guard; he's a combo guard. He can average 20 points a game. He did average 20 points a game for the Nets, but it's that sort of thing. And then as time goes on, he gets more and more frustrated, and as he gets more and more frustrated, his game is affected. I mean, I know what he said publicly, but I also know what his people were saying, not just to me, but to other journalists. And they were very, very, pissed off at how the Nets had treated him. And it was pissed off personally. It was pissed off professionally. And that is one example of what went on. And I think to a certain extent, the circumstances drove it. But I also think they probably had higher goals for some of the individual players than could have been achieved.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about many times, that says everyone's sort of or many times that this roster seemed to be players slotted one slot up above, like a little bit of the Peter principle, honestly, where it's like everyone was functioning at one level past their core competency. I have more questions here for Bob. We're going to get into the future of this Nets team as well and where he kind of sees this thing going. We'll go into that here in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Nissan. If you are the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further, ever wonder what a venture could look like around the next corner, this is where Nissan has you covered. They got a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. They got the 2024 Nissan Rogue, perfect for city drives and great escapes. You get the Google built in. It's always you're updating your system, assistant to call for almost anything. You don't have to worry about connecting your phone. Google Assistant has you covered. Or the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder, room up to 8, expansive cargo capacity, 284 horsepower, 6,000 pounds of towing. You got the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Pathfinder, or the Nissan Armada. Go find your next big adventure. Shop Nissan.usa.com. All right. So we've looked a little bit at this season. I think that we're probably pretty much on the same page on sort of like what the problems are, is in the sense that there wasn't one problem. It was sort of a death. It does feel like a death by 1,000 paper cuts, slight sort of issue that maybe things were masked earlier in the season. Going forward, the Nets, I'm going to be careful about how I construct this, because I think you and I have maybe, or I know you have probably, like, we've disagreed a little bit about the reporting here. So I want to make sure I couch this correctly. At the trade deadline, the Nets were, I think, maybe facing a little bit of a choice, and the choice might have been like existential as much as organizational, about like sort of the future of the team, right? And maybe it wasn't a choice in their minds. I think it was a choice among fans' minds, but maybe the Nets didn't see this as a choice. About whether to stay the course or potentially pursue opportunities that would have reset the franchise on a different path, which would be like a more of a rebuilding, let's call it tanking, rebuilding, resetting, whatever it is. If it's the thing, the team probably would have gotten worse, or definitely would have gotten worse in the short term. That could have included trading Mikal Bridges back to Houston for, we're not sure exactly what.
Correct.
Where do you see? I think at the time you were pretty vocal and about not liking that path, right? And I think there's good reasons for it. But are you still? Where do you stand with, like, when you look at that path? Do you see it as a viable option for the team? Do you think it's like non-starter because you think the team would never consider it? Like, or where do you stand in thinking about this team sort of like building toward the future?
Well, I mean, I think that despite the euphemisms of retooling, restoring,
Sure.
rebooting, whatever, they are in a rebuild. They are doing everything a rebuilding team does except tear it down. And there is a distinction between rebuilding and tearing it down. They admit to me, and have admitted to me since last June, that doing what they were planning to do, which is winning while rebuilding or competing while rebuilding, is a very difficult proposition. Historically, that's the case. But there were a number of factors that they believed militated towards staying with the rebuild. And I can go through with you, everything that they've done that rebuilding teams do. I mean, starting with the Kyrie trade. And for example, I mean, I think they've picked up 8 first-round picks since then, or swaps. All but one of them, all of the ones that they've picked up are unprotected. They picked up, I forget how many second rounders. I think it's probably, like 6. They have cut salary, which is what a rebuilding team does, and use some of those second rounders to do it, with Joe Harris and Patty Mills, both of whom are now out of the league, but would have made $26.7 million this year. And they went young in the draft, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting to me is the debate about the Bridges trade for 4 or 5 first-round picks, not further described. No idea whether we're talking about, protected picks, unprotected picks, whatever. Is that I was tweeting with Sam Quinn of CBS Sports the other day, and one of the things that I tweeted and which he agreed with was, the Nets already have a very, very large and very, very valuable stash of draft capital. And here's the thing that I think really explains this fairly well. The Oklahoma City Thunder's draft stash is the gold standard. Everybody talks about how many picks they have. But as Quinn said, if you go deeper into that, of the 16 first-round picks that they have through 2016, 11 of them are unprotected. The others are protected in such a way so that if the picks aren't chosen, they become second-rounders and or cash. If you look at the Nets stash, they have one fewer unprotected picks, and their picks are higher quality. And what Quinn said in this back and forth on Twitter that we had was that he thought that the Nets stash was probably more valuable than the Thunder stash. So, I mean, that's that, and he's not the only one who's done that. Eric Pincus did an analysis of overall picks, and he put the Nets in the top 5 of overall draft stashes, and that was before and he did everything. He did traded picks, he did their own picks, he did second rounders, he did pick swaps. All that considered, he had them at number 5. And that was before they picked up, 3 second rounders for Royce O'Neal. And, as a parenthetical, I mean, 3 second rounders can go a lot farther now than they used to before this current CBA. I mean, Steven Adams was traded for 3 second rounders. And you can say, well, they had to get under the second apron. That's fine. But that's what you can do under the new CBA. That's one of the reasons why they're so valuable. So, they have draft picks. And if you look at the 4 assets that the Rockets have, the Nets are not interested in the 2024 draft. And one of the key reasons is, obviously, it's been seen as a mediocre draft. The other thing is you would have to guarantee a first-round pick. And if it is it looks like it's going to be the 8th pick now, that's a $5 million a year contract. And if you're trying to preserve cap space for Nick Claxton or something else, then giving somebody $5 million when you really think in another draft that person may only be worth 3 because of the mediocrity of the 2024 draft. All right, so they're not interested in the 2024 draft. The 2025 swap is the key thing. And if you read what Michael Scotto said, he said several of the assets would be given to the Nets, sent to the Nets. I can't imagine them sending the 2025 pick swap. If you go a little further, you have 2 others. You have the 2026 first rounder, unprotected. We don't know what the 2026 draft is going to look like at this point. We know 2025 is going to be good. We know 2024 is projected to be bad. And then the last asset is 2027 swap. If you look at what the Nets already have in the 2027 draft, they have 3 firsts and 3 seconds. They have their own first, which they may have to swap with Atlanta, but they also have unprotected first from the Mavericks, unprotected first from the Suns, and then they have 3 second-round picks. So the value of a swap in a draft where you're going to have 6 picks is not that great. So do you want to send Mikal Bridges, who they love, who is a very, very good player, who doesn't miss any games, and who has a reputation for leadership, recruiting, etc., for what is essentially a mixed bag of assets? By the way, one of my most one of the things that drives me crazy the most is people saying, well, Mikal Bridges is only a role player. And that's fine if you want to believe that. But as Woj said, there were teams that were offering 4 and 5 first-round picks. When was the last time a role player, quote unquote, was able to bring back 4 or 5 first-round picks. There are things he does statistically that are very good, but there is beyond that intangibles, whether that is recruiting, whether that is leadership, whether that is selling tickets because of who he is, that I think you have to also factor into this. So, I mean, that was the key decision, as you said. It was somewhat existential, but I don't think they ever considered doing that. I mean, look, I shouldn't say that. They consider everything. Sure. That's the way Sean Mark's front office works. There's plan A, there's plan B, there's plan C, etc. And they have a big enough staff where they, and from what I understand, I mean, it's fairly open, and I'm sure they had discussions of this, but I don't think it was ever serious. I don't think there was ever any indication that they wanted to get rid of Bridges.
One place I push back on, well, it's not a pushback, but it's just so we're going back to the OKC comparison, right? With draft picks, I think the one difference, and I think this is actually where maybe I might differ on some of this thought process around it, is that I agree with that. Like that pick stash looks great, but the difference in comparing pick stashes, because you have to do two things at the same time. You have to compare what they have in terms of upcoming picks, but you have to also compare with what they have in terms of already on the roster, right? So when you look at OKC and you look at their future picks, you're like, okay, but they also have Shea and Chet and Jalen Williams, like 3 probably legit stars on the roster already.
Kitty, who was up,
right. And so, and they have all these and young guys, and then on top of that with the picks, the problem I think with the Nets, where the Nets are, is that I don't disagree with you that this pick stash is good, right? Like now it's sort of out of their control, but it's still good, right? Like they need a few other things to kind of work out. Some of these other teams to like Phoenix, like to like kind of go into their own little tank to really help, as one example. The problem I think is, or where I've been more a proponent of the reset, or, let's just call it tear it down tank piece of this, is that one, resting back any of the control you have over your own pick, so you can sort of like understand picking your path a little better, right? Because they can't do that right now. Yeah, but also because the Nets roster doesn't compare to some of these other teams. I like Bridges, and I think they have other nice parts, but it's nowhere near talent-wise. We said it earlier in the podcast. It's nowhere near talent-wise some of these other teams. So when you are deficient in talent sort of already, it's nice to have the picks, but it's almost like they need those picks and their own back to just get the talent baseline back up to where it should be. Is that a fair assessment?
Here's the difference between Oklahoma City and the Brooklyn Nets. Oklahoma City is not going to be, unless they really turn into a great place, a great team, and they could, it's never going to be a free agent lure. Sure. Never. Yeah. I mean, people say, well, look at San Antonio. San Antonio is almost unique in the way they built that team. And there was good fortune involved.
Well, they just drafted first a bunch of years. Yeah, so
but they also drafted, Tony Parker at 29 and Manu Ginobili at 58. And I think that the draft capital too often is seen by fans as, well, we're going to wait till 2027 and then we'll have, all these various picks. Those picks are the basis of what they are going to try to do to get the next level star. They want to build up that draft stash so they have the flexibility. So the flexibility can be used for a pick if they want, but also can be used, as an asset to get a top line, player who may not be happy. And I know that there's a lot of debate on that. And, we're waiting for the next star. Well, maybe you're waiting for the next star, but also maybe you're just trying to be flexible. And I think the flexibility offered by that draft stash is something that you have to take into consideration. And I think that, Oklahoma City has got to build up their draft stash. They have to, because they're not going to get they're not going to get top level free agents to come there.
I think that's a fair way to think about it. I still think that there's like a gap for me in terms of just the talent on this roster, but there's a world where never mind. I don't think I'm misreading. I do think there's a talent gap overall. I do have a few more questions for Bob here, if he has the time, about just like sort of the Nets' future and maybe who those superstars could be. And I do have a Ben Simmons question. Want to get into that here in one more second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, when you're buying tickets, the last thing you want to do is have it be a hassle. You want to know where you're going to sit. You want to make sure you're getting the great price. You want to just go to that sporting event, the music, the concert, the comedy show, the theater event near you. You want to just make it easy so you can get to the place where you love. Killer last-minute deals. They got all-in prices. They got views from your seat. They get the best price guarantee. You can go to Gametime right now. Grab Nets tickets. You can go Pelicans at Nets starting at $32 over in Gametime. Take that. A little pricier for Nets at Knicks coming up here at the end of the month, starting at $159. But, hey, that's a big ticket. Makes sense why it'd be a little bit more. It's all there for you over on Gametime. Download the Gametime app. Create an account. Use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account. Redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. All right, closing things out with the great Bob Windrem, NetsDaily, NetIncome. Star hunting.
Yeah.
Do you see this is obviously clearly like the path they want to take? There's been no secret around it. They have said it. I was going to say they all but said it, but they have said it. Do you think that, what would you say the timeline for that is? If you had to put your best guess on it, I'm not asking you to have the source this. I don't think this could be sourced, but like the best guess for Nets adding a superstar, and like, do you have thoughts on who that could be? Because I think the word superstar sometimes can have a wide spectrum of which many names can sit. Right. When and who do you see this sort of like happening on the Nets timeline?
Again, I think, and I haven't talked specifically in a while to anybody about this, but that luxury tax threshold issue remains through next year. What happened was they went over the luxury tax so many years during the big three that they had to pay out a lot of money, but they also got themselves into a bind. If you were over the luxury tax 3 years out of 4, then you had to pay. You had to pay starting in that next year. And they've been over the luxury tax for a long time, and they don't want to get into a situation where they're having to pay the repeater tax, which in some cases, depending on how high you go, is $4.50 for every dollar. If you signed a vets minimum guy, if you're a really big spending team and you sign a vets minimum guy, normally that would cost you $2 million. It would cost you 10 under certain circumstances. So I'm not sure that next year is going to be. Now, I don't know this, and again, but I'm saying that priority of staying below the threshold is still a very big one. And maybe you can get a deal done. Maybe things can change. But I think that they are aiming, and they've said this, either publicly or privately, 2025. 2025 is a big free agent year, and 2025 is when they'll be out of the cycle. They'll still, assuming they keep what they have, they'll still have some, interesting contracts and some interesting players. But before that, I don't see much. And in terms of the names, there's the obvious one, Donovan Mitchell, who last week, said Barclays Center was his second favorite place to play. I remember LeBron saying that Brooklyn was his favorite New York borough, and everybody went nuts. So, I didn't put much faith in that. And, and they're the second seed right now, and they're very, very good. And he doesn't have to make a decision for a year, et cetera, et cetera. They win a championship. What does that mean for him? Does he want to stay there? I don't know. how happy is Giannis right now? He was happy 2 weeks
Oh,
ago.
yeah.
And it goes on. And I think that one of the things, unfortunately, that we look to as a model is 2019 and the clean sweep. But that was pretty unique because both of those guys were free agents.
Yeah.
And they had the cap space and they had planned that out extremely well. And, I'm not sure it would have happened if they hadn't gone to the playoffs that year. I don't know. It was, and nobody expected them to go to the playoffs. I remember Dmitry Razumov telling me that year, start again. I told him that I wanted them to win 42 because that's what I had predicted. This was the last game of the season. I wanted them to win. It would have been the 42nd win. That's what I had predicted in the Reporters Roundtable. And he was shocked. He said, "Did you actually write that somewhere?" I said, "Yes." And then he told me he thought that the optimum for that season was 37. So the way they played in 2018-19 was also a factor in getting free agents.
And I think that's a core difference that people need to kind of like hold close, is that like KD and Kyrie came to a team that had just made the playoffs, that had a core you could kind of vision, which is, I do see as like sort of a fundamental difference in like this current, sorry to interrupt you, but in this current group is like, this group is well below that waterline right now. Right. And so it's like a little harder to see.
Right. And that's why I thought a 42-win season would be successful, because you would once again show to the league, show to prospective free agents, and by the way, not just those people, but show to potential executives, the whole Megillah, that you are on the rise. And what happened this year is now gone over to the other side. And if I'm looking at things and saying, I don't understand what's going on here, but there does appear to be a malaise, I don't think that's a mystery anywhere in the league. I mean, people are looking at the Nets and going, what's going on there? I mean, how many times have I heard that? What's going on there? What's going on there? Well, it's hard actually to tell. And that is also something that was not the case in 2019. In 2019, they had a very, very good milieu, if you want to say that. They had they had good guys. They had Karras and they had Jared and they had D'Lo and then they had Jared Dudley and they had the dancing and they had Theo. That whole milieu is nowhere near what we have right now. Now we have people who are down on their luck. And one of the things that I learned this morning, which is one of those PowerPoints that just that make you even more confused. They are now 27th in the league in free throw shooting.
Yeah.
75.4%. I mean, that's inexcusable.
It's the reason they lost. It's one of the main reasons they lost the Magic game, frankly. It's probably the reason they lost the game, like among all the different things. And I think you're right around looking at like that other that 19 team, and going back to 18 too, to some degree, is that like the sort of the overall gestalt of that team was just felt different, right? Like across everything, and it was like a team on the rise. And maybe the talent levels aren't even that different.
Team. And a fun team.
And honestly, there could be there's a good chance that this team is much more talented, honestly, but it's just that it's breaking down at a number of different levels, and comparatively to expectations, it's running into problems too. One last question here. We're gonna get you out the door because we've already gone a little long. Well, I'm gonna ask two questions because this one might not be that uplifting. Ben Simmons, we have 21 games left in this season. We have 82 games left next season. He's on the books for this season and next season, like you mentioned before, over $40 million. How many games, if you were to predict right now, of that 103, do you think he plays for the Nets from here March 5th on? He's already been ruled out for the Tuesday game, so not worried about that one.
Well, there's a range between 0 and 103, and I would be way down at one end of that. What Bernie Lee, his agent, said last night to Ian Begley, was that, it's my fault. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I should have figured out a better way to help him. That was really, really, to me, shocking.
Yeah.
It's shocking because agents don't do that, number one. It's shocking because 2 weeks ago, he said he will fix all their issues. I mean, that's a direct quote from him. And that was unsolicited, all right? And then a month ago, he talked about how this was a non-recurring injury, that it's not a cycle. Well, last night, he talked about trying to get out of the cycle. So it's completely different. And I've had contact with Bernie Lee, as have a number of reporters. He's very open. But I looked at that last night as a prelude to something much worse. I looked at it because he also said, we want to rule out surgery, second back surgery, but he didn't.
Yeah.
So they're going through a number of things, and it's the Ben Simmons thing is like bizarre in its own right. Putting aside the team, it's just bizarre in its own right, because you have all these comments from him and from Bernie about how we're going to bring it back and how this is going to fix things, and then suddenly something else comes up, and it's been this up and down wave, and most fans have just given up on it. It's like, whatever, Bernie. And I don't know what they're going to do. They have options, none of which, in my opinion, are very good. And I think, those options include things like just, we'll play out that last, that last year, and that'll be it. So you can buy him out. You can buy him out and stretch him. If he has surgery again, you can ask for a disabled player exception, yada, yada, yada. But there's none of those things. None of those things have any, there's nothing good about any of those.
I think sometimes you're reading tea leaves, and sometimes you're just reading what's written on the paper, right? Like, I think I think it seems to me to be the latter here. And I totally agree with you. Last question, out the door, rest of the season. Nets in the play-in, in the lottery. Where do you see them finishing off this year?
Well, I don't see them in the play-in. I think a lot. Look, we're talking the day after the Grizzlies game. The 76ers are coming up tonight. If they revert to their Atlanta Hawks level and beat the 76ers, well, then they'll be, and the Knicks beat the Hawks tonight. Well, then they're a game and a half out of the play-in, and there's some hope. But on the other hand, if they lose, then I just think it starts to spiral. And at this point in time, God love Kevin Ollie, because he's going to have to get them beyond what happened last night. And that's not going to be easy. I mean, they're professionals, et cetera. And, Cam Thomas looks like he'll be back, if not tonight, then, the next game. But again, it goes back to what is going on here. And coaches changed. The guy who seemed to have the most problem with the coach, Dinwiddie, is gone. But basically nothing, after last night, you wonder if anything changed or anything will change. And at this point, I'm not very optimistic.
There's a way to sum up the Nets season. It's at this point, I'm not very optimistic is probably the way is probably it ends up becoming the call line for the season. The great Bob Windrem, at NetsDaily over on Twitter. If you want to mix it up with him on the Twitter streets, he is as active as it gets over there, and will push back on you if you say something he doesn't like. So make sure you go meet him over there. Make sure you are reading NetsDaily if you aren't already, where he is NetIncome. Bob, thanks so much for joining us today. Hopefully we can do this again.
I hope so as well, and I hope under better circumstances.
Same. Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye-bye.